Angry bike mechanic again. Gonna do another thing on the Shimano brakes, maybe a little bit more detail this time. So apparently they need a lot more attention than what I'm giving them on this channel, but they actually do. They need a ton more attention than any other brake system. Mineral oil, I will post a blog post or a link to my blog on the mineral oil subject. Hydraulic oil has a blackening property, and it's not necessarily by design, but it is a result of the design of the chemical. So anyway, let's get into this a little bit, and I'll show you a little bit about the bleeding process that I do and why I do it this way. Okay, notice the dangle. I want this in full dangle. I don't want, I do this in full dangle because I don't want any air to get caught in like a downward loop like that. You see, there's places for air to get caught on the way bikes are routed with their hose lines. So keep that in mind. Having full dangle makes a ton of sense. So top to bottom, I've got all the way up to the lever here. Got my funnel, and I'm going to bleed this anti-gravity, so inverse of Shimano's recommendation of using gravity bleed. And the reason that is why I remove this from the bike. Now, I often am doing full services on bikes, so I often bleed this caliper as well off the bike. One of the reasons to do that, aside from doing a full service where I'm going to take the fork off so the caliper comes off anyway, is to be able to rotate and shift the position of the caliper laterally, so that if there's any error in there, you can work it out by repositioning the bleed, the caliper during the bleed process. So what I did is I cracked this open just a teeniest bit and let some of the old oil flow up. So you saw that. That way there's no air other than what's in the syringe when I drop this syringe on here. Now the syringe is full of mineral oil. Be aware that when you put mineral oil in, or you suck it up, air can get into your fluid as you're drawing it in from your container. This position allows you to draw some of the air out of the caliper. Anyway, what you see is dark fluid coming up. I don't know if you can really see that, but it's kind of got a gray. Anyway, now that I've drawn a bunch of air out, I'm gonna push that through, or a bunch of that dark fluid, and then slowly just kind of rotate this. And what I want to do is I want to be able to drop this and get this low so that I'm pushing the air. If there is air, now I'm pushing it up the line into that stupid funnel up there that Shimano made. So the fluid coming out actually isn't that bad. See, this is actually some of the cleanest fluid that I've drawn out. There you go. Some of the cleanest fluid that I've drawn out of one of these brakes. So that's probably more like 10 cc's. But as clean as this brake is, that's more than enough for this brake. Apparently this bike just hasn't been getting ridden. But just for the sake of time, I probably won't show bleeding more. I can do that off the camera. What I'm going to skip to next is kind of the reattachment. All right, so once you got your caliper all sealed off, before you put the brake pads in, make sure you have a bleed block in there. Make sure the caliper pistons, the slave pistons in there, have been retracted enough for the bleed block to fit. And then come back up here, squeeze your lever, and then push your whatever bleed port block screw thing that Shimano has going on up here, then install that. Then what I do is a little bit of rubbing alcohol. I use a 91% isopropyl alcohol. Again, you'll see a lot of that on this channel. It's used really well for cleaning out oil. Cleans up that, and that lever is actually ready at this point to go back into position. So I'm gonna go ahead and rock that back down, and then I'm gonna take the camera back to the other end of the bike. All right, so coming back down here, what I've got is a bit of a mess of oil because of the way this thing's set up. As a downside, if I had my way, every brake would bleed like the Avids do with their new disconnect and a jig or whatever it's called. That little thing, bleed magic. Anyway, so I like to get that oil out of there, and I like to come back to my favorite substance, 91% isopropyl alcohol. And it doesn't have to be a super clean rag, but you do need to get the oil off of this thing. Mineral oil is really good at permeating surfaces and just flowing along a surface until it can find something it can absorb into. And yeah, like your brake pads. So this gives you an opportunity to clean up everything. So let's reattach this brake. What I did here, in order to keep track of everything and make it simple for myself, this is an old caliper adapter that you thread into, and makes it so I can have it off the bike without losing any parts, without putting the parts on my bench. As a pro mechanic, that's one of those tricks that just saves you a whole bunch of time in the long run. I'm gonna go ahead and reinsert my pads, and that's how I did this. Get a close up there. That's not a close up. There we go. See how I did that? With these, I put that in because that's how they come out, and this helps me keep the direction of the pads organized. Believe it or not, these pads are worn to a particular rotor, and so it makes it easy. So then I can just reinsert the pads the way they were, and now these brakes are going to work better because they've got fresh fluid. And load up this this little guy. There we go. Make sure your safety pin is safe. I like to loosely attach the zip ties that hold your cable in place, and until after the caliper is adjusted to the rotor. What this does, as you create tension or pressure, braking pressure, as you squeeze the brake lever, you actually stiffen the hose and the line, the brake line, to a point where it can actually affect the positioning of the caliper as you try to tighten it down if the hose is fastened into place. Old trick I learned from the guys at Shimano. So before I tighten those zip ties down, I do that. Now, here's where I'm answering a specific question. So when you're reattaching your brake, your initial pumps are going to just flex the caliper a little bit. You figure out how to do this without bumping the camera too much. And it's gonna feel loose at the lever. Well, as you slowly pump and cycle that brake, the lever feel is going to return. And now that that's falling back into position, I start to tighten down the caliper. And then I look on either side of the pads to make sure there's a gap. Well, sometimes as you spin the wheel, the gap alternates because rotors are pretty imperfect. They are just naturally warped. Not by design, but just because they're made out of cheap steel. And that's all there is to it. If you're running the Shimano Ice Tech ones, I fasten these bolts down to about a 5 Nm torque spec. Don't go too crazy, because you can actually strip out these the threads on the inside of the frame, or fork for that matter. So the rotor's warp. I can get into another video about rotor warp. I think I could spend at least 5 minutes talking about that. Anyway, this isn't dragging. All right, so coming back up to the lever, during the pad reset to the rotor, you felt like it lost some pressure. You went further in on the stroke, and then it would return. And this is where it's stopping now. So you feel a nice solid wall right there, back wall. So that brake has reset, and it's a healthy brake. It's not got any sticking that's causing the caliper to push the pistons out more, which creates the brake pad drag on the rotor. It's just a happy brake. So for you pro mechanics, I want you to look at this. You got some exposed thread. Now to me, that's not normal to have that much exposed. And I put my wrench to it, I get a few more turns with the lightest amount of pressure. I want to make sure that olive and barb are loaded the way they're supposed to be. Now I run into this a lot with bikes that are freshly assembled in Taiwan and shipped to the United States. And this is one of those. Make sure your plumbing's tight. Not crazy tight, snug. So we've wrapped up this brake, and I literally showed you all the tricks I use for getting a healthy Shimano brake back into like operational status. But this is where I should actually be drinking a really strong beer, because talking about Shimano brakes from time to time can make me a little upset. Partly because they're just frustrating with the frequency of the oil blackening, which is actually corrosive to the inside of the brake, to the XT pump problem. And if you read, especially I think on probably the 8000 series, there's a pump problem. And it's people, even on the new brake, you have to pump to get that brake to feel good. And you have to do that throughout your ride. The problem I've noticed is no matter how much you bleed that brake, you're going to continue to have that problem. I don't install Shimano brakes on people's bikes anymore. And I know some people are huge believers. I personally will only run SRAM as the main company. If you want a premium experience, there's hope. But I shy away from systems that use mineral oil. DOT 5.1 is not only perfectly acceptable, it stands up better to all the problems that I've run into with brakes over the last 5 years. So DOT-based brakes have been problematic up until just recently. But keep in mind, if you're running these newer brakes, especially at the level of XT or XTR, where the caliper is minimized, the brake lever is absolutely minimal, there's not very much fluid in there, so the fluid can go bad quickly. If you're not on top of your bleeding, that blackening of the oil happens quick, and it can rapidly disintegrate the inside of your brake system, and then you're left feeling like the brake doesn't respond. So if you're bleeding your brake and hoping to return to the old pressure that you had before, you may not be able to do that. And if your brakes are within, from Shimano, I believe 3 years, you should address getting a warranty concern with your local bike shop. Normally, like with this brake, you should have, after you bleed it properly with the bleed block, you should have that back pressure even after the pads have adjusted. You should have a good solid feel to lever. The pad should be in position, and you should have space between the rotor and the pads. Plain and simple. If you're not experiencing that, you may need to have a pro take a look at your brakes, and you may need to have them replaced under warranty or replaced altogether. If you feel like you engage the brakes and the point of contact that back wall feel of the brake lever gets closer and closer to your bar, there's either air in the line still, which try this method, full dangle, that's what I call it, full dangle method. And if that doesn't work, have a pro take a look at it. And if the pro takes a look at it and like, this isn't working, you need to replace that brake or have Shimano do it. Shimano's really good with warranties when they've got a problem because they usually know about it. Anyway, Angry Bike Mechanic, y'all. I hope I answered the questions. If you have other questions, please leave them in the comments. I'm more than happy to answer them. And if I don't know the answer, it gives me a reason to go search in and dig in and bug in other people. So bike industry is full of little nuances like this, and the products are always in question, especially as quickly as they're changing. So I will post a link to my blog detailing some of the characteristics of hydraulic oil and how it breaks down. And it's not new information, it's very old. So check it out if you want to read it. It's kind of technical.